You've got 20 minutes before that bird is grounded for good. Ryan Cole snapped, his voice cutting through the humid Texas air as he slammed his gloved hand against the cold steel of the AH-64 Apache, the hollow thud echoing across the tarmac like a verdict already passed, the rotor blades above them hanging limp and lifeless in the late afternoon heat, while a digital countdown ticked down on a nearby console. 19:42. 19:41. A silent reminder that somewhere beyond the horizon, a mission was waiting and this helicopter was supposed to be part of it. Except it wasn't moving, not even a twitch, despite 12 certified technicians, 3 diagnostic laptops, and a system that insisted everything was green. Every sensor lit, every circuit verified, every line of code screaming that the machine should be alive. But it wasn't, and that contradiction was eating at Cole like a splinter under the skin, making his jaw tighten as he paced in short, sharp steps, boots crunching over loose gravel. The smell of hot metal and jet fuel thick in the air, while Captain Aaron Hayes stood a few yards back, arms crossed, watching the scene unravel with a controlled tension that didn't quite hide the pressure building behind his eyes. Because this wasn't just another maintenance delay, this was a schedule that didn't bend, a timeline measured in minutes and miles. And right now, both were slipping away, and then there was the old man, standing just outside the circle of activity like he didn't belong to any of it, his posture relaxed, hands resting loosely at his sides, a faded denim jacket hanging off his shoulders like it had been through more years than anyone on that tarmac, his hair silver, his face lined, but his eyes weren't wandering. They were fixed on the helicopter with a kind of quiet focus that didn't match the chaos around him, and that alone irritated Cole more than anything else, because it felt like judgment without a word being spoken. "You lost or something, sir?" Cole called out, not even trying to hide the edge in his tone. "This is a restricted area." The words "sir" landing flat, stripped of respect, just a formality, the kind you give someone you expect to leave. But the old man didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't even look at him right away, his gaze still locked on the Apache, as if it were speaking a language only he could hear. And that silence stretched just long enough to make it uncomfortable, long enough to draw a few glances from the younger techs who had already written him off as some misplaced civilian, maybe a contractor who wandered too far, or worse, someone's idea of a last-minute joke. "Hey," Cole pressed, stepping closer. Now, wiping grease onto a rag with quick, irritated motions. "We've got advanced diagnostics running, full system sweep, manufacturer support on standby. So unless you've got a degree in avionics I don't know about, you're just in the way." A couple of the techs snickered under their breath, the tension breaking just enough for arrogance to slip back in. Because that was easier than admitting they were stuck. Easier than facing the fact that a $35 million aircraft was sitting dead in front of them with no explanation. Captain Hayes finally shifted, his boots making a soft scrape as he stepped forward, his voice measured but firm. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step back behind the line." He gestured toward the painted boundary on the concrete, the one no one without clearance was supposed to cross. But again, the old man didn't react the way they expected. He simply took one slow step closer to the helicopter instead, closing the distance with an ease that felt almost deliberate, and for the first time, his eyes flicked away from the engine housing and met Hayes's, calm, steady, and unreadable. "General Kane asked for me," he said, his voice low, gravelly, carrying just enough weight to cut through the noise without rising above it. And for a fraction of a second, something in the air shifted, subtle but real, like the first change in wind before a storm, but Cole just scoffed, shaking his head as he tossed the rag aside. "Right," he muttered, a thin smile pulling at the corner of his mouth. "And I suppose you're here to fix what a room full of specialists couldn't." The countdown clock kept ticking behind them. 18:57. 18:56. And somewhere deep in the machine, unseen and unheard, something remained silent that shouldn't have been, something the system couldn't detect, something no one here had noticed yet, except maybe the one man they were already trying to send away. The words settled into the air with a weight that did not match their volume. And for a moment, even Ryan Cole did not respond, his eyes narrowing slightly as he followed the old man's line of sight to that narrow seam along the engine cowling, a detail so small it felt almost irrelevant compared to the glowing certainty of the diagnostics behind him. Yet something about the way the man said it, not defensive, not speculative, just quiet and absolute, made it harder to dismiss than it should have been. "What does that even mean?" Cole finally said, but the edge in his voice had dulled, replaced by something closer to irritation mixed with uncertainty, the kind that comes when a problem refuses to stay inside its assigned box. The countdown slipped lower, 14:37. 14:36. Each second pulling tighter against the silence. Captain Hayes shifted his stance, his gaze moving between the technician and the old man, weighing procedure against instinct, because everything about this situation was off balance now. The system said one thing, reality said another, and standing in the middle of it was a man who did not seem surprised by either. "Explain it," Hayes said, his tone measured but firmer now, giving the old man something Cole had not, a sliver of authority. And that changed the dynamic just enough for the rest of the crew to notice. The old man did not turn immediately, his eyes still tracing that same line, as if confirming a thought that had been forming long before he arrived. "Machines talk," he said quietly. "Not in numbers, not in code, but in patterns, rhythm, timing." He paused, his head tilting slightly, listening to something no one else could hear. "Right now this one is too quiet." A few of the younger technicians exchanged glances, confusion flickering across their faces, one of them tapping a key on his laptop as if expecting a hidden warning to appear, but the screen remained unchanged, bright and reassuring in a way that no longer felt convincing. Cole let out a short breath, shaking his head as he pointed toward the open diagnostic panel. "We have pressure readings, fuel flow, ignition sequence, all within spec. There is nothing missing." But even as he said it, his voice lacked the earlier certainty, because the contradiction was still there. The aircraft was not running, and that fact did not care what the numbers said. The old man finally moved, not abruptly, but with a deliberate step forward, closing the last few inches between himself and the panel, his hand rising again, this time resting lightly against the metal, his fingers brushing over the surface as if feeling for something beneath it. And that contact, simple and quiet, triggered something deeper, something older. The heat of the Texas tarmac faded for just a second in his mind, replaced by a different kind of warmth, thick, humid air pressing in from all sides, the steady pulse of rotor blades cutting through it, not loud, but constant, dependable, a sound that meant the difference between staying and leaving, between waiting and moving on. And in that memory there had been no screens, no diagnostics, just instinct sharpened by repetition, by hours and days and years spent listening, watching, learning the subtle shifts that came before a failure, the slight hesitation in a cycle, the fraction of a second where something did not align, and then the memory was gone, replaced again by the silent Apache in front of him, his fingers still, resting against the panel. "It is not failing yet," he said softly. "It is waiting." The word landed differently, not technical, not something that could be plotted on a graph, but it carried a meaning that hung in the space between them. And for the first time, Cole did not interrupt. He just watched, his frustration now tempered by something else, something he did not want to name. Specialist Noah Grant felt it too. That shift, subtle but undeniable, and without drawing attention to himself. He stepped back, pulling a small device from his pocket, his thumb hovering over the screen as he glanced once more at the old man, at the calm in his posture, the certainty in his voice, and then down at the name he quietly typed into the system, Jack Mercer, the letters appearing one by one, simple, unremarkable, and yet something about entering them felt like crossing a line he could not step back from. The countdown continued its steady march, 13:02, 13:01, and somewhere beyond the immediate tension of the tarmac, a signal began to move, silent and unseen, carrying that name upward through channels no one here could access. While at the helicopter, the old man withdrew his hand and looked at Captain Hayes for the first time with a directness that left no room for doubt. "If you want it to start," he said, "you have to open it." Ryan Cole let out a sharp breath the moment the words landed, the tension snapping back into place like a stretched cable pulled too tight. "Open it," he repeated, disbelief returning to his voice as he took a step forward. pointing directly at the sealed panel the old man had been studying. That panel is factory sealed. Breaking it triggers a full maintenance audit, paperwork, downtime. And if we open it for no reason, we ground this aircraft for days, not minutes. His voice rose slightly. Not out of anger alone, but out of pressure, the kind that builds when every decision carries consequences that ripple beyond the moment. The countdown behind them dropped lower, 12:18. 12:17. Each second now louder, heavier, pressing against every word spoken on that tarmac. Captain Hayes did not respond immediately, his jaw tightening as he looked at the panel, then at the diagnostic screen, then back at the old man, caught between protocol and instinct, because everything Cole said was correct, by the book, by procedure, by every system they trusted. And yet none of those systems had brought that engine back to life, and time was running out. We are not opening anything. Based on a guess, Cole added, folding his arms as if closing the discussion entirely. But the old man did not react to the resistance, did not argue, did not raise his voice. He simply looked at Hayes with the same calm certainty that had not shifted since he arrived. It is already failing, he said quietly. You just have not seen it yet. The statement did not challenge them. It defined the situation in a way that left no room for comfort, and that made it harder to ignore. Specialist Noah Grant stood a few steps back, his eyes flicking down to the small device in his hand. The signal he had sent moments ago still moving somewhere beyond his reach. He did not know who would receive it, or how quickly, but he knew enough to understand that names like that did not just disappear into a system without consequence. He glanced up again, watching as the silence stretched, broken only by the faint hum of generators and the steady countdown, 11:46. 11:45. Captain Hayes exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but heavy. If we open that panel and you are wrong, he said, his eyes fixed on the old man. This aircraft is out of operation for the rest of the day, minimum. It was not a threat, it was a fact, one that carried weight, responsibility, and risk. The old man nodded once, as if acknowledging something obvious. If you do not open it, he replied, it will not start at all. There was no emphasis, no dramatics, just a simple line drawn between two outcomes. And that simplicity cut deeper than any argument could have. Cole shook his head again, pacing a few steps as he ran his hand through his hair, frustration mixing now with something more unstable, something that came from being unable to fully dismiss what he was hearing. This is not how this works, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as if repeating the rules might make them hold again. But the helicopter remained silent, unmoved by rules or systems or confidence, just sitting there under the fading light, waiting, exactly as the old man had said. The heat shimmered off its surface, distorting the air just enough to make the stillness feel unnatural, and in that distortion, in that quiet, doubt continued to grow, not loud, not obvious, but present. Captain Hayes looked once more at the panel, then at the countdown, 10:58, 10:57. The window closing faster now, the margin for safe decisions narrowing with each passing second. He made a decision then, not fully certain, not fully comfortable, but necessary. Get the tools, he said, his voice steady, cutting through the tension with quiet authority. Cole stopped mid-step, turning sharply toward him. Captain, that is against protocol. Hayes did not raise his voice, did not argue. He simply held Cole's gaze. So is missing the mission. The words landed heavier than any order, because they shifted the priority from rules to outcome, from procedure to purpose. And for a moment, Cole said nothing, the conflict visible in the tightness of his jaw. But the countdown did not wait. 10:21, 10:20, and finally, with a sharp exhale, he turned toward the tool bench, grabbing a sealed kit with more force than necessary, the metal clasps snapping open with a crisp click as he walked back toward the panel. If this goes wrong, he muttered, not looking at the old man, it is on you. The old man did not respond. He simply stepped aside, giving them space, his eyes never leaving the aircraft, as if he already knew what they were about to find, or perhaps what they were about to finally hear. The metallic click of the toolkit echoed sharper than it should have, each latch snapping open with a finality that seemed to draw every eye on the tarmac toward that single panel. Ryan Cole knelt beside it, his movements precise but tense, The kind of control that came from years of training now pressed under the weight of doubt, his gloved fingers moving to the bolts with practiced efficiency as the tool bit into the first one. A short, controlled turn, breaking the factory seal with a faint crack that sounded louder than any warning alarm. The countdown continued behind them. 09:48. 09:47. And with each loosened bolt, the line between protocol and necessity blurred further. Captain Hayes stood just over Cole's shoulder, arms no longer crossed, his posture forward, engaged, watching every movement with a focus that left no room for distraction. While a few of the younger technicians leaned in despite themselves, curiosity pushing past their earlier confidence. Because this was no longer routine, this was something else, something uncertain, something that had already stepped outside the system they trusted. The last bolt came free, and Cole hesitated for just a fraction of a second, his hand resting on the edge of the panel as if weighing the moment. Then he pulled it loose, lifting it away with a controlled motion and setting it aside on the concrete. The interior was clean, pristine even, wires neatly routed, components aligned exactly as the schematics dictated, nothing loose, nothing broken, nothing that justified what they were seeing from the outside. Cole exhaled through his nose, a short, sharp sound that carried both relief and frustration. "There is nothing here," he said, his voice firm again, reclaiming ground. "Everything is exactly where it should be." He glanced back over his shoulder toward the old man, as if expecting some reaction, some acknowledgement of error. But Jack Mercer had already stepped closer, his gaze dropping into the open compartment, not scanning, not searching, just observing with that same quiet intensity, as if the answer was not hidden, but simply waiting to be recognized. He crouched slowly, the movement deliberate, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the frame as he leaned in. And for a moment, the noise of the tarmac seemed to fade again, replaced in his mind by something older, the steady rhythmic pulse of a different rotor, a different machine, one that had never relied on perfect diagnostics or clean data, one that had demanded attention in a different way, through vibration, through sound, through the subtle shift in timing that told a story long before failure ever appeared. The memory flickered and passed, leaving behind only the instinct it had built. His eyes narrowed slightly, focusing on a small section near the rear of the compartment, a narrow junction where two lines met, perfectly aligned to anyone looking for faults, perfectly invisible to any system designed to detect them, but not to him. His fingers lifted, hovering for a moment before pressing gently against the housing, not applying force, just feeling. And then he tapped it once, lightly, a small, almost insignificant sound, but it echoed differently, hollow in a way that did not match the rest of the structure. "There," he said quietly, not raising his voice, not pointing dramatically, just indicating the spot with a slight movement of his hand. Cole leaned in immediately, his earlier confidence replaced by sharp focus, his eyes scanning the area, his fingers following the same line, checking connections, seals, tolerances, everything reading normal, everything looking correct, and yet that sound lingered in his mind. That difference, subtle but real. "It is seated," he said after a moment, though the certainty in his voice was thinner now. "Torque is within spec." Mercer shook his head once, a small motion. "It looks seated," he replied. "It is not." The distinction hung between them, simple and absolute. And for a second, Cole did not argue. He just stared at the component, his mind running through possibilities he had not considered before. The countdown dropped again. 08:22. 08:21. And suddenly the time felt shorter than it had a moment ago, because now there was something to act on, something that might actually change the outcome. Captain Hayes stepped closer, his voice low but direct. "Can it be corrected?" Mercer did not hesitate. "Yes," he said, and for the first time since the engine had failed, the word carried something different, not hope, not guesswork, but certainty, quiet and grounded. And in that moment, every eye on that tarmac shifted toward him. Because the silence of the machine was no longer just a problem, it was a question, and he was the only one who seemed to know the answer. Ryan Cole did not look away from the component this time, his earlier resistance replaced by a focused urgency that sharpened every movement. "What is wrong with it?" he asked, not as a challenge, but as a demand for clarity, his voice lower now, controlled, the kind of tone used when the margin for error has disappeared. Jack Mercer did not rush his answer, his eyes still fixed on the junction as his fingers hovered just above it. "It is misaligned by less than a fraction of an inch," he said, quietly, not enough for the system to flag, but enough to disrupt the timing sequence when the engine cycles up. Cole frowned, leaning in closer, his trained eye scanning the alignment, checking angles, tolerances, everything that should reveal that kind of issue, but the difference was so slight it might as well not exist to anyone relying on measurements alone. "That should not stop ignition," Cole said, though the certainty in his voice had thinned further. Mercer nodded once, acknowledging the logic. "It does not stop it," he replied. "It delays it, just enough that the system resets before the cycle completes." The explanation settled into place, simple, precise, and suddenly the contradiction made sense. The system saw no failure because technically there was none, only a loop, a cycle that never completed. Hayes stepped closer, his eyes moving between the two men, absorbing the exchange. "Can you fix it?" he asked again, more direct this time. Mercer reached into his jacket slowly, pulling out a small, worn leather pouch. The material darkened with age, edges softened from years of use, the snap polished smooth. It looked out of place against the clean lines of modern equipment, almost insignificant. And yet when he opened it, the motion carried a weight that drew attention. Inside were a few simple tools, nothing advanced, nothing digital, just metal shaped by purpose and time. Cole watched with a mixture of skepticism and something else he did not fully recognize, because everything about this contradicted the systems he trusted. Mercer selected a small wrench, its surface worn but cared for, and leaned into the compartment, his movement steady, unhurried, as if time itself had slowed around him despite the countdown pressing on. 07:14. 07 to 13. His fingers guided the tool into place with precision that did not come from manuals or schematics, but from memory, from repetition, from years of understanding how machines behaved when they were pushed beyond perfect conditions. For a moment, the present seemed to fade again for him, replaced by a different setting, the vibration of an older aircraft beneath his hands, the hum uneven, the rhythm off by just enough to signal something wrong before it ever became visible, the air thick, the stakes unspoken but understood. And in that memory he had learned not to wait for confirmation, not to rely on perfect readings, but to trust the pattern, the subtle shift that told the truth before the system could. The memory passed, leaving only the action. He adjusted the component carefully, a slight turn, then another, each movement measured, deliberate, not forcing anything, just guiding it back into alignment. Cole leaned closer, watching every motion now, his skepticism giving way to something closer to respect, because there was no hesitation in what he was seeing, no guesswork, just quiet certainty translated into action. Hayes remained still, his focus locked on the process, the countdown slipping lower. 06:02. 06:01. Every second now heavier than the last. Mercer paused, his hand still on the tool, as if listening again, feeling for that same rhythm he had described. Then he made one final adjustment, a small movement that seemed almost insignificant, and withdrew the tool, his fingers brushing lightly against the housing one last time, confirming what he already knew. He closed the pouch without ceremony and stepped back, giving the space back to the team. "Try it now," he said, his voice calm, unchanged, as if the outcome was already decided. Cole hesitated for only a fraction of a second before moving, his hand reaching for the control panel, his eyes flicking once toward Hayes, who gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. The decision made, the moment set, and as Cole initiated the startup sequence, the entire tarmac seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the silence would finally break. Ryan Cole's finger hovered over the control for half a second longer than it should have, not out of hesitation alone, but because everything he had trusted up to this moment had already failed him once, and pressing that switch now meant accepting something he could not fully explain. The countdown behind him cut through the silence. 05:18. 05:17. And then he pushed it. The startup sequence initiated with a low electronic tone, the system coming alive exactly as it had before, screens flickering, indicators aligning, the familiar process unfolding step by step. and for a brief moment it felt the same. Too perfect, too clean, like before, but then something changed, subtle at first. Almost impossible to notice unless you were listening for it. The faintest shift in the internal rhythm of the machine, a delay that had been there before now gone, replaced by a smoother transition, a continuity that had been missing. Cole's eyes narrowed as he leaned closer to the panel, watching the sequence progress, waiting for the reset, the silent failure that had cut it off every time before. But it did not come. The cycle continued, uninterrupted, building instead of collapsing, and then the engine responded, not all at once, not dramatically, but with a low, steady ignition that rolled through the frame of the aircraft like a breath finally taken after being held too long. The sound grew, deepening, stabilizing, the rotor above them twitching, then turning, slow at first, deliberate, gathering momentum with each pass until the blades began to cut through the air with a steady, controlled rhythm. The heat shimmer shifted as the machine came to life, the stillness broken, replaced by motion, by sound, by presence. And for a moment no one spoke, the entire team frozen in place, watching something they had already written off return as if it had never been gone. Cole stepped back slightly, his eyes still fixed on the engine, disbelief and recognition colliding in his expression as he glanced down at the diagnostics. The readings now aligning not just on the screen, but in reality. The system finally matching the machine. "It is holding," one of the technicians said quietly, almost as if speaking too loudly might disrupt it. Hayes did not respond immediately, his gaze locked on the spinning rotor, the controlled power of it, the confirmation of a decision that had stepped outside every rule he had been trained to follow. And then he turned, slowly, toward Jack Mercer, who had already stepped back from the aircraft, his posture unchanged, his hands at his sides, watching not with pride or satisfaction, but with the same quiet awareness he had carried from the beginning. As if this outcome had never been in question, Cole followed Hayes's gaze, his earlier frustration gone, replaced now by something heavier, something harder to define, respect mixed with the unsettling realization that everything he had relied on had nearly cost them the mission. He opened his mouth as if to say something, to ask something, but the words did not come, because there was no simple way to frame what had just happened. The countdown continued, now almost secondary, 04:02. 04:01. The urgency still there, but transformed, because the problem was no longer whether the aircraft would fly, but how close they had come to it not flying at all. Specialist Noah Grant lowered the device in his hand slowly, his eyes moving from the now active helicopter to the old man, the connection forming in his mind between the name he had sent and the man standing quietly in front of him. And somewhere far beyond the tarmac, beyond the noise and heat and motion, that same name had already reached someone else, someone who understood exactly what it meant. And back on the ground, as the rotor speed increased and the Apache settled into a steady, controlled idle, the silence that followed was not empty. It was heavy, filled with realization, with the weight of what had almost been missed, and with the presence of a man who had seen it long before anyone else knew where to look. The rotor's steady rhythm filled the air now, no longer a question but an answer, the deep, controlled hum settling into a cadence that every trained ear on that tarmac recognized immediately as stable, reliable, alive, and yet no one moved to celebrate. No one broke the silence that followed, because what they had just witnessed was not a victory in the usual sense. It was something else, something that carried weight, the kind that pressed down quietly rather than lifting anything up. Ryan Cole stood there with his hands still near the control panel, his posture stiff, his eyes fixed on the spinning blades as if they might suddenly stop again and prove this was all a mistake. But they did not. The machine held its rhythm, consistent, unwavering, and slowly, almost reluctantly, he stepped back, creating space he had not offered before, his gaze shifting toward Jack Mercer with a different kind of focus now, one that no longer searched for error but for understanding. Captain Hayes turned fully this time, his attention no longer split between the aircraft and the decision, now centered entirely on the man who had made both possible. And for a moment, the chain of command, the structure that defined everything here, seemed to pause, recalibrate, because it had just been bypassed by something older, something quieter, something that did not need authority to be right, Specialist Noah Grant felt the vibration of his device before he heard it, a subtle pulse against his palm. He looked down instinctively, the screen lighting up with a secured notification, the kind that did not come through normal channels. His eyes scanned it quickly, and the color drained slightly from his face as recognition settled in, not of the message itself, but of the response it represented, because someone had received that name, and they had answered immediately. He looked up toward Captain Hayes, taking a step forward with a hesitation that came from knowing he was crossing into something above his level. "Sir," he said quietly, holding out the device. Hayes took it without a word, his eyes moving across the screen, reading, processing, and then pausing, just for a second. As the information connected with the man standing a few feet away, the silence deepened, not broken, but reinforced. Hayes lowered the device slowly, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, shoulders squaring, stance tightening, not out of tension, but out of recognition. He stepped toward Mercer, not hurried, not hesitant, but deliberate, each step carrying the weight of something understood too late. "Why were we not informed?" Hayes asked, his voice low, controlled, but no longer neutral. Mercer did not answer immediately, his gaze drifting briefly back to the helicopter, the steady rotation of the blades reflecting in his eyes, then returning to Hayes, calm as ever. "You were not supposed to need me," he said simply, and the truth of that settled heavier than any explanation could have. Cole let out a quiet breath, the sound almost lost under the hum of the engine, his mind replaying the last 20 minutes, every dismissal, every assumption, every moment he had been certain he understood the situation, now reframed by a reality he had not even considered. The countdown in the background slipped further, 02:11, 02:10, but it no longer carried the same pressure, because the outcome had already changed. The mission was back on track, the machine was ready, and yet the focus had shifted entirely, from what had been fixed to who had fixed it, and why no one had recognized it sooner. Hayes glanced once more at the device in his hand, then back at Mercer, the pieces aligning fully now, the name, the response, the certainty. "You are Jack Mercer," he said, not as a question, but as a confirmation. Mercer did not react to the name, did not nod, did not deny it. He simply stood there, as he had from the beginning, present, quiet, unchanged, and in that stillness, the realization settled across the entire team, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because the man they had almost sent away was no longer just an old civilian on the edge of the tarmac. He was something else entirely, something the system had not recognized, but someone far above them had. The sound of the rotors settled into a steady, unwavering rhythm, cutting through the air with a precision that now felt almost symbolic, not just of a machine brought back to life, but of something restored that had nearly been overlooked entirely. Captain Hayes stood facing Jack Mercer, the confirmation of his name still hanging in the space between them, heavier now than any rank or title could have been, and for a moment, the structure of authority that defined the base seemed to realign itself around a truth that had been present from the start. Hayes drew in a slow breath, then straightened fully, his posture shifting with deliberate intent, not as a reaction, but as a correction. "Sir," he said, the word no longer a formality but a recognition, clear and unmistakable, and with that single word, the tone of the entire scene changed. Ryan Cole saw it immediately, felt it even more, the weight of his earlier words pressing back on him as he stepped forward slightly, his shoulders no longer squared in defiance but lowered in acknowledgement. He opened his mouth, searching for something to say, something that could reconcile the gap between what he had believed and what he now understood, but nothing came that felt sufficient, because there was no simple way to undo dismissal once it had been given. Mercer did not react to the shift, did not acknowledge the change in tone or posture. He simply looked past them for a moment, his gaze settling on the Apache, now fully operational, the rotor cutting clean arcs through the air, the engine holding steady without hesitation, exactly as it should have from the beginning. And then he turned back, his expression unchanged, calm, grounded, as if none of this had altered anything within him at all. The countdown reached its final minute, 00:59, 00:58, but now it felt distant, almost irrelevant, because the outcome had already been secured. Hayes glanced once more at the device in his hand. The confirmation still there, the response from command unmistakable in its urgency and respect, and he understood now why it had come so quickly, why a single name had triggered that kind of reaction. He lowered the device and stepped aside, not as an order, but as a gesture, clearing the path between Mercer and the aircraft, an unspoken acknowledgement that whatever role Mercer had here, it was not one that needed permission. Cole mirrored the movement a second later, stepping back as well, creating space where there had been resistance before. The rest of the team followed without being told, the shift moving through them quietly, instinctively, until the area around Mercer was open, not empty, but respectful. Specialist Noah Grant stood still, watching it all with a clarity that would stay with him long after this moment passed, because he had seen the transition happen in real time, from dismissal to recognition, from noise to silence. Mercer took one final look at the aircraft, his eyes tracing the motion, the sound, the subtle details that confirmed everything was as it should be. Then he gave a small nod, almost to himself, and turned away, not waiting for thanks, not expecting acknowledgement, just stepping back from the machine as if his part had always been temporary. Hayes watched him go, the realization settling fully now, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant, and he spoke once more, not loudly, but clearly enough for those closest to hear. "Make sure this aircraft is logged correctly," he said, his eyes still following Mercer's slow, steady walk away from the tarmac, "and make sure his name is never missed again." Cole nodded without hesitation, the instruction landing differently than any order he had received before, because this one was not about procedure, it was about memory, about recognition, about ensuring that what had nearly been overlooked would not be forgotten a second time. The rotor continued its steady rhythm. The mission resumed, the base returning to motion, but the silence that had settled in that moment did not fully leave. It lingered, quiet and heavy, carried not in the sound of the machine, but in the understanding that followed it. Because respect had not been demanded here, it had been revealed, and once seen, it could not be unseen, not by anyone who had been there to witness it.